Hi, everybody. This is Allison from Allykatkreations. How are you? We're a little rested. I had to take a break from reading. I did a wasp bay and it blew up. Now it's going back down. Thunderstorms are coming, so the heat will calm and hopefully this gets better. So please like, share, and subscribe if you haven't done so already. I'm going to do section 2, part 2 of the fundamental principles of the Metaphysic of Morals. Now, caution, big time. Because of my mouth, there might be words I cannot project out. I have a huge gaping part of my gum chilling out on my bridge that I can take it in and out. If you're on True Social, you should go check out my pictures. I'm asking a certain person who had their teeth done, Parmesan cheese, if he could pay for my teeth because I didn't do anything wrong with my teeth. I had botched dentistry. And a lot of fluoride, which is not good for you, in my mouth throughout the years. And I had my teeth replaced. Now I need implants. Or those hypothetical med beds. Either way, I still need my teeth pulled. Because, you know, I love not being able to eat solid food. I really enjoy not being able to speak clearly and project words properly. So part 2, and this is section 2. 1, a man reduced to despair by a series of misfortunes feels wearied of life, but is still so far in possession of his reason that he can ask himself whether it would not be contrary to his duty to himself to take his own life. Now he requires whether the maxim of his action could become a universal law of nature. His maxim is, from self-love, I adopt it as a principle to shorten my life, whether its longer duration is likely to bring more evil than satisfaction. At this moment in time, I kind of agree. Just in this moment. It is asked then simply whether his principle founded on self-love can become a universal law of nature. Now we see at once that a system of nature of which it should be a law to destroy life by means of the very feeling whose special nature it is to imply and impel to the improvement of life would contradict itself and therefore could not exist as a system of nature. Hence the maxim cannot possibly exist as a universal nature of law of nature and consequently would be wholly inconsistent with the supreme principle of all duty. 2, another finds himself forced by necessity to borrow money. He knows that he will not be able to repay it, but sees also that nothing will be lent to him unless he promises stoutly to repay it in a definite time. He desires to make this promise, but he has still so much conscience as to ask himself, is it not unlawful and inconsistent with duty to get out of difficulty in this way? Supposed, however, that he resolves to do so, then the maxim of his action would be expressed thus: when I think myself in want of money, I will borrow money and promise to repay it, although I know that I can never do so. Now, this principle of self-love or one's own advantage may perhaps be consistent with my whole future welfare, But the question now is it right? I change then the suggestion of self-love into a universal law and state that the question thus, how would it be if my maxim were a universal law? Then I see at once that it could never hold as a universal law of nature, but would necessarily contradict itself. For supporting it would be a universal law that everyone, when he thinks himself in a difficulty, should be able to promise whatever he pleases, with the purpose of not keeping his promise. The promise itself would become impossible, as well as the end that one might have in view in it, since no one would consider that anything was promised to him, but would ridicule all such statements as vain pretenses. Our government should be asking that question right now. 3. A third finds in himself a talent which, with the help of some culture, might make him a useful man in many respects, but he finds himself in comfortable circumstances and prefers to indulge in pleasure rather than to take pains in enlarging and improving his happy natural capacities. He asks, however, whether his maxim of neglect of his natural gifts, besides agreeing with his inclination to his inclination to indulgence, agrees also with what is called duty. He sees then that a system of nature could indeed subsist with such a universal law, although men, like the South Sea Islanders, could let their talents rust and resolve to devote their lives merely to idleness, amusement, and propagation of their species, in a word, to enjoyment. But he cannot possibly will that this should be a universal law of nature, or implanted in us as such by a natural instinct. For as a rational being, he necessarily wills that he facilitates be developed, since they serve him and have been given him for all sorts of possible purposes. 4. A fourth, who is in prosperity, while he sees that others have to contend with great wretchedness, and that he could help them, thinks, what concern is it of mine? Let everyone be as happy as heaven pleases, or as he can make himself, but I will take nothing from him, nor even envy him. Only I do not wish to contribute anything to his welfare or to his assistance in distress. Now, no doubt, if such a mode of thinking were a universal law, the human race might very well subsist, and doubtless ever better than in a state in which everyone talks of sympathy and goodwill, or even takes care occasionally to put it into practice. But on the other side, one cheats when he can, betrays the rights of men, or otherwise violates them. But although it is possible that a universal law of nature might exist in accordance with that maxim, it is impossible to will that such a principle should have the universal validity of a law of nature. For a will which resolved this would contradict itself, inasmuch as many cases might occur in which one would have need of the love and sympathy of others, and in which by such a law of nature sprung from his own will, he would deprive himself of all hope of the aid he desires. These are a few of many actual duties, or at least what we regard as such, which obviously fall into two classes on the one principle that we have laid down. We must be able to will that a maxim of our action should be a universal law. This is the canon of the moral appreciation of the action generally. Some actions are of such a character that their maxim cannot without contradiction be even conceived as a universal law of nature, far from it being possible that we should will that it should be so. In others, this intrinsic impossibility is not found, but still it is impossible to will that their maxim should be raised to the universality of a law of nature, since such a will would contradict itself. It is easily seen that the former violate strict or rigorous inflexible duty, the latter only laxer duty. Thus, it has been completely shown by these examples how all duties depend on regards the nature of the obligation, not the object of action, on the same principle. If now we attend to ourselves on occasion of any transgression of duty, we shall find that we, in fact, do not will that our maxim should be a universal law, but that it is impossible for us. On the contrary, we will that the opposite should remain a universal law. Only we assume the liberty of making an exemption in our own favor, or just for this time only in favor of our inclination. Consequently, if we consider all cases from one and the same point of view, namely that of reason, we should find a contradiction in our own will, namely that a certain principle should be objectively necessary as a universal law, and yet subjectively should not be universal, but admit of exceptions, as however we at one moment regard our action from the point of view of a will wholly conformed to reason, and then again look at the same action from the point of view of a will affected by inclination. There is not really any contradiction, but an antagonism of inclination to the precept of reason, whereby the universality of the principle is changed into a mere generality, so that the practical principle of reason shall meet the maxim halfway. Now, although this cannot be justified in our own imperial judgment, yet it proves that we do really recognize the validity of the categorical imperative, and with all respect for it, only allow ourselves a few exceptions, which we think unimportant and forced from us. Again, government, go take a check of yourselves. Again, I'm reading this in a time of now. We have thus established at least this much, that if duty is a conception which is to have any import in real legislative authority for our actions, it can only be expressed in categorical and not at all in hypothetical imperatives. We have also, which is of great importance, exhibited clearly and definitively for every practical application the content of the categorical imperative, which must contain the principle of all duty, if there is such a thing at all. We have not yet, however, advanced so far as to prove a priori that there actually is such an imperative, that there is a practical law which commands absolutely of itself and without any other impulse, and that the following of this law is duty. With the view of obtaining to this, it is of extreme importance to remember that we must not allow ourselves to think of deducing the reality of this principle from the particular attributes of human nature. For duty is to be a practical, unconditional necessity of action. It must therefore hold for all rational beings, to whom an imperative can apply at all, and for this reason only be also a law for all human wills. On the contrary, whatever is deduced from the particular nature characteristics of humanity, from certain feelings and propensions, nigh even, if possible, from any particular tendency proper to human reason, and which need not necessarily hold for the will of every rational being, this may indeed supply us with a maxim, but not with a law, with a subjugative principle on which we may have propension and inclination to act, but not with an objective principle on which we should be enjoined to act, even though all our propensions, inclinations, and natural dispositions were opposed to it. In fact, the sublimity and intrinsic dignity of the command and duty are so much the more evident, the less the subjective impulses favor it, and the more they oppose it, without being able in the slightest degree to weaken the obligation of the law or to distinguish its validity. Here then we see philosophy brought to a critical position. since it has to be firmly fixed, notwithstanding that it has nothing to support it either in heaven or earth. Here it must show its purity as absolute dictator of its own laws, not the herald of those which are whispered to it by an implanted sense, or who knows what trutarily nature. Although these may be better than nothing, yet they can never afford principles dictated by reason, which must have their source wholly a priori, and thence their commanding authority accepting everything from supremacy of the law and due respect for it, nothing from inclination, or else condemning the man to self-contempt and inward abhorrence. Thus, every empirical element is not only quite incapable of being an aid to the principle of morality, but even highly prejudicial, to the purity of morals. For the proper and estimable worth of an absolutely good will consists just in this, that the principle of action is free from all influence of contingent grounds, which alone experiences can furnish. We cannot too much or too often repeat our warning against this lax and even mean habit of thought, which seeks for its principle amongst empirical motives and laws. For human reason in its weariness is glad to rest on this pillow and in a dream of sweet illusions, in which, instead of Juno, it embraces a cloud. It substitutes for morality a bastard patch up from limbs of various decoration, which looks like anything one chooses to see in it, only not like virtue to one who has once beheld her in her true form. I really like that passage. This question then is this: is it a necessary law for all rational beings that they should always judge of their actions by maxims of which they can themselves will, that they should serve as universal laws? If it is so, then it must be connected altogether a priori with the very conception of the will of a rational being generally. But in order to discover this connection, we must, however, reluctantly take a step into metaphysics, although into a domain of it which is distinct from speculative philosophy, namely the metaphysic of morals, in a practical philosophy where it is not the reason of what happens that we have to ascertain, but the laws of what ought to happen, even although it never does. Objective practical laws, there it is not necessary to inquire into the reasons why anything pleases or displeases, how the pleasure of mere sensation differs from taste, and whether the latter is distinct from a general satisfaction of reason, on what the feeling of pleasure or pain rests, and how from its desire and inclinations arise, and from this again maxims by the cooperation of reason. For all this belongs to an empirical psychology, which would constitute the second part of physics. If we regard physics as the philosophy of nature, so far as it is based on empirical laws. But here we are concerned with objective practical laws, and consequently with the relation of the will to itself, so far it is determined by reason alone, in which case whatever has reference to anything empirical is necessarily excluded, since if reason of itself alone determines the conduct, and it is the possibility of that we are now investigating, it must necessarily do so a priori. I'm going to put a pause right there. Author Schopenhauer argued against this. A little bit. The will is conceived as a faculty of determining oneself to action in accordance with the conception of certain laws, and such a faculty can be found only in rational beings. Now that which serves the will as objective ground of itself determined is the end, and if this is assigned by reason alone, it must hold for the rational beings. On the other hand, that which merely contains the ground of possibility of the action of which the effect is the end, This is called the means. The subjective ground of the desire is the spring. The objective ground of the volition is the motive. Hence, the distinction between subjective ends, which rest on springs, and objective ends, which depends on motives, valid for every rational being. Practical principles are formal when they abstract from all subjugative ends. They are material when they assume these, and therefore a particular spring of action. The ends which a rational being proposes to himself at pleasure as effects of his actions, material ends, are all only relative, for it is only their relation to the particular desire of the subject that gives them their worth, which therefore cannot furnish principles universal and necessary for all rational beings and for every volition, that is to say, practical laws. Hence, all these relative ends can give rise only to hypothetical imperatives, supporting, however, that they were something whose existence has in itself an absolute worth, something which being can end in itself, could be a source of definite law. Then in this, and this alone, would lie the source of possible categorical imperative of practical law. Now I say man, and generally any rational being, exists as an end in himself, not merely as a means to be arbitrarily used by this or that will, but in all his actions, whether they concern himself or other rational beings, must be always regarded at the same time as an end. All objects of the inclinations have only a conditional worth, for if the inclinations and the wants founded on them did not exist, then their object would be without value. But the inclinations themselves, being sources of want, are so far from having an absolute worth for which they should be desired, that on contrary, it must be the universal wish of every rational being to be wholly free from them. Thus, the worth of any object which is to be acquired by our action is always conditional. Beings whose existence depends not on our will, but on nature's, have nevertheless, if they are irrational beings, only a relative value as means, and are therefore called things. Rational beings, on the contrary, are called persons, because their very nature points them out as ends in themselves, that is, as something which must not be used merely as means, and so far therefore restricts freedom of action and is an object of respect. These, therefore, are not merely subjective ends, whose existence has a worth for us as an effect of our action, but objective ends, that is, things whose existence is an end in itself, and moreover for which no other can be substituted, which they should subserve merely as means, for otherwise nothing whatever would possess absolute worth. But if all worth were conditioned and therefore contingent, then there would be no supreme practical principle of reason whatever. If then there is a supreme practical principle, or in respect of the human will, a categorical imperative, it must be one in which, being drawn from that conception of that which is necessarily an end for everyone because it is an end in itself, constitutes an objective principle of will, and can therefore serve as a universal practical law. The foundation of this principle is rational nature exists as an end in itself. Man necessarily conceives his own existence as being so. So far, then, this is a subjective principle of human actions, but every other rational being regards its existence similarly, just on the same rational principle that holds for me, so that it is at the same time an objective principle from which, as a supreme practical law, all laws of the will must be capable of being deduced. Accordingly, the practical imperative will be as follows. So act as to treat humanity, whether in thy own person or in that of any other, in every case as an end withal, never as means only. We will now inquire whether this can be practically carried out to abide by the previous examples. To abide by the previous examples, firstly, under the head of the necessary duty to oneself, he who contemplates suicide should ask himself whether his action can be consistent with the idea of humanity as an end in itself. If he destroys himself in order to escape from painful circumstances, he uses a person merely as a means to maintain a tolerable condition up to the end of life. But a man is not a thing, that is to say, something which can be used merely as a means, but must in all his actions be always considered as an end in himself. I cannot therefore dispose in any way of a man in my own person so as to mutilate him, to damage or kill him. It belongs to ethics proper to define this principle more precisely so as to avoid all misunderstandings. As to the amputation of the limbs in order to preserve myself, as to exposing my life to danger with a view to preserve it. This question is therefore omitted here. Secondly, as regards necessary duties or those of strict obligation towards others, he who is thinking of making a lying promise to others will see at once that he would be using another man merely as a mean, without the latter containing at the same time the end in himself. For he would I propose by such a promise to use for my own purposes cannot purposely assent to my mode of acting towards him, and therefore cannot himself contain the end of this action. This violation of the principle of humanity in other men is more obvious if we take in examples of attacks on the freedom and property of others. Hi, government! For then it is clear that he who transgresses the rights of men intends to use the person of others merely as means, without considering that as rational beings they ought always to be esteemed also as ends, that is, as begins, who must be capable of containing in themselves the end of the very same action. Gitmo must be getting really full. Just saying. Thirdly, as regards contingent duties to oneself, it is not enough that the actions does not violate humanity in our own person as an end in itself. It must also harmonize with it. Now there are in humanity capacities of greater perfection which belong to the end that nature has in view in regard to humanity and ourselves as a subject. To neglect these might perhaps be consistent with the maintenance of humanity as an end in itself, but not with the advancement of this end. Fourthly, as regards meritorious duties towards others, the natural end which all men have in their own happiness. Now humanity might indeed subset, although no one should contribute anything to the happiness of others, provided he did not intentionally withdraw anything from it. But after all, this would only harmonize negatively, not positively, with humanity as an end in itself, if everyone does not also endeavor as far as in him lies to forward the ends of others, for the ends of any subject which is an end in itself ought as far as possible to be my ends also, if the conception is to have its full effect with me. This principle that humanity and generally every rational nature is an end in itself, which is the supreme limiting condition of every man's freedom of action, is not borrowed from experience, firstly, because it is universal, applying as it does to all rational beings, whatever, and experience is not capable of determining anything about them. Secondly, because it does not present humanity as an end to men subjugatively, that is an end object which men do of themselves actually adopt as an end, but as an objective end, which must as a law constitute the supreme limiting condition of our subjugative ends. Let them be what we will. It must therefore spring from pure reason. In fact, the objective principle of all practical legislation lies accordingly to the first principle in the rule, and it must form a universality which makes it capable of being a law. But the subjugative principle is in the end Now, by the second principle, the subject of all ends is each rational being, inasmuch as it is an end in itself. Hence follows the third principle, practical principle of the will, which is the ultimate condition of its harmony with the universal practical reason, the idea of the will of every rational being as a universality, legislative will. On this principle, all maxims are rejected, which are inconsistent with the will, being itself universal legislator. Thus, the will is not subject simply to the law, but so subject that it must be regarded as itself given the law, and on this ground only subject to the law, of which it can regard itself as author. In the previous imperatives, namely, that based on the conception of conformity of actions to general laws, as in physical system of nature, and that based on the universal prerogative of rational beings as ends in themselves, this imperatives, just because they are conceived as categorical, excluded from any share in their authority all admixture of any interest as a spring of action. There were, however, only assumed to be categorical, because such an assumption was necessary to explain the conception of duty, but we could not prove independently that there are practical propositions which command categorically, nor can it be proved in this section. One thing, however, could be done, namely to indicate in the imperative itself by some determinate expression that in the case of volition from duty or interest is renounced, which is the specific criterion on categorical as distinguished from the hypothetical imperatives. This is done in the present third formula of the principle, namely in the idea of the will of every rational being as a universally legislating will. For although a will which is subject to laws may be attached to this law by means of an interest, yet a will which is in itself a supreme lawgiver, so far as it is reached, such cannot possibly depend on any interest, since a will so dependent would itself still need another law restricting the interest of its self-love by the condition that it should be valid as universal law. Thus, the principle that every human will is a will, which in all its maxims give universal laws, provided it be otherwise justified, would be very well adapted to be categorical and imperative in this respect, namely that just because of the idea of universal legislation is not based on any interest, and therefore it alone among all possible imperatives can be unconditional. Or still better, converting the propositions, if there is a categorical imperative, a law for the will of every rational being, it can only command that everything be done from maxims of one's will regarded as a will which could at the same time will that it should itself give universal laws. For in that case, only practical principle and the imperative which is obeys it are unconditional, such they cannot be based on any interest. Looking back now on all previous attempts to discover the principle of morality, we need not wonder why they all fail. It was seen that man was bound to laws by duty, but it was not observed that the laws to which he is subject are only those of his own giving, though at the same time they are universal, and that he is only bound to the act in conformity with his own will, a will, however, which is designed by nature to give universal laws. For when one has conceived man only as subject to a law, no matter what, then this law required some interest, either by way of attraction or constraint, since it did not originate as a law for his own will, but this will was according to a law obliged by something else to act in a certain manner. Now by this necessary consequence, all the labor spent in finding a supreme principle of duty was irrevocable loss, for men never elected duty, but only a necessity of acting for a certain interest, whether this interest was private or otherwise. In any case, the imperative must be conditional and cannot by any means be capable of being a moral command. I will therefore call the principle of autonomy of the will in contrast with every other, which I accordingly reckon heteronomy. The conception of every rational being as one with which must consider itself a giving in all the maxims of will, its universal laws, so as to judge itself and its actions from the point of view. This conception leads to another which depends on it and is very fruitful, namely that of the kingdom of ends. The conception of every rational being as one which must consider itself as giving in all maxims of its will universal laws, so as to judge itself and its actions from the point of view. This conception leads to another which depends on it and is very fruitful, namely that of the kingdom of ends. But a kingdom, I understand the union of different rational beings in a system by common laws. Now, since it is by laws that ends are determined as regards their universal validity, hence, if we abstract from the personal differences of rational beings, and likewise from all content of their private ends, we shall be able to conceive all ends combined in a systematic whole, including both rational beings as ends in themselves, and also the special ends, which each may propose to itself. That is to say, we can conceive a kingdom of ends, which on the preceding principle is possible. All rational beings come under the law that each of them must treat itself and all others never merely as means, but in every case at the same time as ends in themselves. Hence result a systematic union of rational beings by common objective laws, a kingdom which may be called a kingdom of ends, since what these laws have in view is just a relation of these beings to one another as ends and means. It is certainly only an ideal. A rational being belongs to one member of the kingdom of ends, when although giving universal law in it, he must also himself subject to these laws. He belongs to it as a sovereign when, while giving laws, he is not subject to the will of any other. A rational being must always regard himself as giving laws, either as member or as sovereign in a kingdom of ends, which is rendered possible by the freedom of will. He cannot, however, maintain the latter position merely by the maxims of his will, but only in case he is completely independent being without wants and with unrestricted power adequate to his will. Mortality consists then in the reference of all action to the legislation which alone can render a kingdom of ends possible. This legislation must be capable of existing in every rational being and of emanating from his will, so that a principle of his will is never to act on any maxim which could not without contradiction be also a universal law, and accordingly also so to act that the will could at the same time regard itself as giving in its maxims universal laws. If now the maxims of rational beings are not by their own nature coincident with the objective principle, then the necessity of acting on it is called practical necessitation, duty. Duty does not apply to the sovereign in the kingdom of ends, but it does to every member of it, and all in the same degree. The practical necessity of acting on this principle, duty, does not rest at all on feelings, impulses, or inclinations, but solely on the relation of rational beings to one another, a relation in which the will of a rational being must always be regarded as legislative, since otherwise it could not be conceived as an end in itself. Reason then refers every maxim of the will regarding it as legislating universally to every other will and also to every action towards oneself, and this not on account of any other practical motive or any future advantage, but from the idea of the dignity of a rational being, obeying no law, but that which he himself also gives. In the kingdom of ends, everything has either value or dignity. Whatever has a value can be replaced by something else which is equivalent. Whatever, on the other hand, is above all value, and therefore admits of no equivalent, has a dignity. Whatever has reference to the general inclinations and wants of mankind has a market value. Whatever, without presupposing a want, corresponds to certain taste, that is, to a satisfaction in the mere purposeless play of our faculties, has a fancy value. But that which constitutes a condition under which alone anything can be an end in itself, this has not merely a relative worth, value, but an intrinsic worth, that is dignity. Now, morality is the condition under which alone a rational being can be an end in himself, since by this alone it is possible that he should be a legislating member in the kingdom of ends. This morality, and humanity as capable of it, is that which alone has dignity. Skill and diligence in labor has a market value. Wit, lively imagination, and humor has fancy value. On the other hand, fidelity to promises, benevolence from principle, not from instinct, have an intrinsic worth. Neither nature nor art contains anything which, in default of these, it could put in their place. For their worth consists not in the effects which spring from them, not in the use and advantage which they secure, but in the disposition of mind, that is, the maxims of the will, which are ready to manifest themselves in such actions, even though they should not have the desired effect. These actions also need no recommendation for any subjective taste or sentiment, that they may be looked on with immediate favor and satisfaction. They need no immediate propension or feeling for them. They exhibit the will that performs them as an object of an immediate respect, and nothing but a reason is required to impose them on the will, nor not to flatter it into them, which in the case of duties would be a contradiction. This estimation, therefore, shows that the worth of such a disposition is dignity, and places it indefinitely above all value, with which it cannot for a moment be brought into comparison or competition without, as it were, violating its sanctity. What then it is which justifies virtue or the morally good disposition in making such lofty claims? It is nothing less than privilege. It secures to the rational being a participating the giving of the universal laws, by which it qualifies him to be a member of a possible kingdom of ends, a privilege to which he was already destined by his own nature as being an end in himself, and on the account legislating in the kingdom of ends, free as regards all laws of physical nature, and obeying those only which he himself gives, and by which his maxims can belong to a system of universal law, to which at the same time he submits himself. For nothing has any worth except that the law assigns it. Now, the legislation itself, which assigns the worth of everything, must for that very reason possess dignity, that it is unconditional, incomparable worth, and the word respect alone supplies a becoming expression for the esteem which a rational being must have for it. Autonomy, then, is the basis for the dignity of human and every rational nature. Sorry, just saw spirit. Flash. Right over there. The three modes of presenting the principle of morality that have been adduced are at bottom only to many formulas of the very same law, and each of itself involves the other two. There is, however, a difference in them, but it is rather subjectively than objectively practical, intended namely to bring an idea of the reason nearer to intuition by means of a certain analogy, and therefore never nearer to feeling All maxims, in fact, one, a form consisting in universality, and in this view, the formula of the moral imperative is expressed thus, that the maxims must be chosen as if they were to serve as universal laws of nature. Two, a matter, namely an end, and there the formula says that rational beings, as it is an end by its own nature, and therefore an end in itself, must in every maxim serve as a condition limiting all merely relative and arbitrary ends. Three, a complete characterization of all maxims by means of the formula, namely that all maxims ought by their own legislation to harmonize with the possible kingdom of ends, as with the kingdom of nature. There is a progress here in the order of the categories of unity of the form of the will, its universality, plurality of the matter, the objects, the ends, and totality of the system of these. In forming our own moral judgment of action, it is better to proceed away on this strict method and start from the general formula of the categorical imperative. Act according to maxim, which can at the same time make itself a universal law. If, however, we wish to gain an entrance for moral law, it is very useful to bring one and the same action under the three specified conceptions, and thereby as far as possible to bring it nearer to intuition. We can now end where we started at the beginning, namely with the conception of a will unconditionally good. That will is absolutely good, which cannot be evil. In other words, those whose maxim, if made a universal law, could never contradict itself. This principle then is its supreme law. Act always on such a maxim as thou canst at the same time will to be a universal law. This is the sole condition under which a will can never contradict itself, and such an imperative is categorical. Since the validity of the will as a universal law for possible actions is analogous to the universal connection of the existence of things by general laws, which is the formal notion of nature in general, the categorical imperative can also be expressed thus: act on maxims which can at the same time have for their object themselves as universal laws of nature. Such then is the formula of an absolutely good will. Rational nature is distinguished from the rest of nature by this, that it sets before itself an end. This end would be the matter of every good will. But since in the idea of a will that is absolutely good without being limited by any condition of obtaining this or that end, we must abstract wholly from every end to be effected. Since this would make every will only relatively good, it follows that in this case, the end must conceive not as an end to be effected, but as an independently existing end. Consequently, it is conceived only negatively, as that which we must never act against, and which therefore must never be regarded merely as an end, but must in every volition be esteemed as an end likewise. Now this end can be nothing but the subject of all possible ends, since this is also the subject of a possible absolutely good will, for such a will cannot without contradiction be postponed to any other object. The principle: so act in regard to every rational being, thyself and others, that he may also have place in thy maxim as an end in himself, is accordingly essential identical with this other. Act upon a maxim which at the same time involves its own universal validity for every rational being, for that it is using means for everyone, for every end. I shall limit my maxim by the conditions of its holding good as a law for every subject. This comes to the same thing as that the fundamental principle of all maxims of action must that be the subject of all ends. The rational being himself being never employed merely as ends, but as the supreme condition restricting the use of all means, that is in every case as an end likewise. It follows inconsistently that to every whatever laws any rational being may be subjected, he being an end in himself must be able to regard himself as also legislating universally in respect of the same laws, since it is just this fitness of his maxims for universal legislation that distinguishes him as an end in himself. Also, it follows that this implies his dignity, prerogative above all mere physical beings, that he must always take his maxims from the point of view which regards himself and likewise other rational being, law-giving beings, on which account they are called persons. In this way, a world of rational beings is possible as a kingdom of ends, and this by virtue of the legislation proper to all persons as members. Therefore, every rational being must so act as if he were, by the maxims in every case, a legislating member in the universal kingdom of ends. The formal principle of these maxims is so act as if the maxim were to serve likewise as the universal law of all rational beings. A kingdom of ends is thus only possible on the analogy of a kingdom of nature, the former, however, only by maxims, that is, self-imposed rules, the latter only the laws of efficient causes acting under necessitation from without. Nevertheless, although the system of nature is looked upon as a machine, yet so far as it has reference to rational beings as its ends, it is given on this account the name of a kingdom of nature. Now such a kingdom of ends would be actually realized by means of maxims conforming to the canon which the categorical imperative prescribes to all rational beings, if they were universally followed. But although a rational being, even if he punctually follows the maxim himself, cannot reckon upon all others, being therefore true to the same, nor accept that the kingdom of nature and its orderly arrangements shall be in harmony with him as a fitting member, as to form a kingdom of ends, to which he himself contributes, that is to say, that it shall favor his expectation of happiness, still the law, act according to the maxim of a member of a merely possible kingdom of ends, legislating it universally, remains in its full force, inasmuch as it commands categorically. And it is just in this that the paradox lies, that the mere dignity of a man as a rational creature without any end or advantage to be obtained thereby, in other words, respect for a mere idea, should yet serve as an inflexible precept of the will, and that it is precisely in this independence of the maxim on all such springs of action that it sublimely consists, and it is that makes every rational subject worthy to be legislative member in the kingdom of ends, for otherwise he would have to be conceived only as subject to the physical law of his wants. And although we should suppose the kingdom of nature and the kingdom of ends to be united under one sovereign, so that the later kingdom thereby cease to be a mere idea and acquire true reality, then it would not, no doubt, gain the ascension of a strong spring, but by no means any increase of its intrinsic worth. For this sole absolute lawgiver must, notwithstanding this, by always conceive and as estimating the worth of rational beings only by their disinterested behavior, or prescribe to themselves for that idea the dignity of man alone. This essence of things is not altered by the external relations, and that which, abstracting from these alone, constitutes the absolute worth of man is also that by which he must be judged, whoever the judge may be, and even by the supreme being. Morality, then, is the relation of actions to the autonomy of the will, that is, to the potential universal legislation by its maxims. An action that is consistent with the autonomy of the will is permitted. One that does not agree with therewith is forbidden. All will whose maxims necessarily coincide with the laws of autonomy is wholly a will, good absolutely. The dependence of a will not absolutely good on the principle of autonomy, moral necessation, is obligation. This then cannot be applied to a holy being. The objective necessity of actions from obligation is called duty. From what has just been said, it is easy to see how it happens that altogether the conception of duty implies subjugation to the law, yet ascribe a certain dignity and sublimity to the person who fulfills all his duties. There is not indeed any sublimity in him so far as he is subject to the moral law, but inasmuch as in regard to the very law, he is likewise a legislator, and on the account alone subject to it, he has sublimity. We have also shown above that neither fear nor inclination, but simply respect for the law, is the spring which can give actions a moral worth. Our own will, so far as we suppose it to act only under the condition that its maxims are potentially universal laws, this ideal which is possible to us in the proper object of respect and the dignity of human consists just in the capacity of being universally legislative, though with the condition that it is itself subject to the same legislation. The autonomy of the will as the supreme principle of morality. Autonomy of the will is that property of it by which is a law to itself independently on any property of the objects of volition. The principle of autonomy that is always so to choose that the same volition shall comprehend the maxims of our choice as a universal law. We cannot prove that this practical rule is an imperative, that the will of every rational being is necessarily bound to it as a condition by a mere analysis of the conceptions which occur in it. Since it is synthetical proposition, we must advance beyond the cognition of the objects to a critical examination of the subject, that is, of the pure practical reason for the synthetic proposition, which commands. I'm going to get it. I'm going to do it. Apoptically must be capable of being cognized wholly a priori. And I know I didn't get that out properly. Boop. This matter, however, does not belong to the present section, but that the principle of autonomy in question is the sole principle of morals, can be readily shown by the mere analysis of the conception of morality. For by this analysis, we find that its principle must be categorical, imperative, and that what this commands is neither more or less than this autonomy. Heteronomy of the will as the source of all spurious principles of morality. If the will seeks the law, which it is to determine in anywhere else than in the fitness of its maxim, to be universal laws of its own dictation, consequently, if it goes out of itself and seeks the law in the character of any of its objects, there always results heteronomy. The will in that case does not give itself the law, but it is given by the object through its relation to the will. This relation, whether it rests on inclination or on conceptions of reason, only admits of hypothetical imperatives. I ought to do something because I wish for something else. On the contrary, the moral and therefore categorical imperative says, I ought to do so and so, even though I should not wish for anything else. The former says, I ought not to lie if I would retain my reputation. The latter says, I ought not to lie, although it should not bring me the least discretion. The latter, therefore, must go far abstract from all objects, that they should have no influence on the will, in order that the practical reason will may not be restricted to administering an interest not belonging to it, but many simply show its own commanding authority as a supreme legislation. Thus, I ought to endeavor to promote the happiness of others, not as if its realization involved any concern of mine, whether be immediate inclination or by any satisfaction indirectly gained through reason, but simply because a maxim which includes it cannot be comprehended as a universal law in one and the same volition. Classification of all principles of morality which can be founded on the conception of Heteronomy. Here as elsewhere, human reason in its pure use, so long as it was not critically examined, has first tried all possible wrong ways before it succeeded in finding the one true way. All principles which can be taken from the point of view are either empirical or rational. The former, drawn from the principle of happiness, are built on physical or moral feelings. The latter, drawn from the principle of perfection, are built either on the rational conception of perfection as a possible effect or on that of the independent perfection, the will of God, as the determining cause of our will. Empirical principles are wholly incapable of serving as a foundation for moral laws, where the universality with these should hold for all rational beings without distinction. The unconditional practical necessity which is thereby imposed on them is lost when their foundation is taken from the particular constitution of human nature or accidental circumstances in which it is placed. The principle of private happiness, however, is the most objectionable, not merely because it is false and experience contradicts the supposition that prosperity is always proportioned to good conduct, nor yet merely because it contributes nothing to the establishment of morality, since it is quite a different thing to make a prosperous man and a good man, or to make one prudent and sharp-sighted for his own interests, and to make him virtuous, but because the springs it provides for morality are such as rather undermine and destroy its sublimity, since they put the motives to the virtue to vice in the same class and only teach us to make a better calculation, the specific difference between virtue and vice being entirely extinguished. On the other hand, as to moral feelings, this supposed special sense, the appeal to it is indeed superficial, when those who cannot think believe that feeling will help them out even in what concerns general laws, and besides feelings which naturally differ indefinitely in degree cannot furnish a uniform standard of good and evil, nor has anyone a right to form judgments for others by his own feelings. Nevertheless, this moral feeling is nearer to mortality and his dignity in this respect, that it pays virtue the honor of ascribing to her immediately the satisfaction and esteem we have for her, and does not, as it were, tell her to her face that we are not attached to her by her beauty, but by profit. Amongst the rational principles of morality, the ontological conception of perfection, without standing it defects, it's better than the theological conception, which derives mortality from a divine, absolutely perfect will. The former is no doubt empty and indefinite, and consequently useless for finding in the boundless field of possibility reality the greatest amount of suitable for us. Moreover, in attempting to distinguish specifically the reality of which we are now speaking from every other, it inevitably tends to turn in a circle and cannot avoid tactility. Presupposing the morality which it is to explain, it is nevertheless preferable to the theological view, first, because we have no intuition of the divine perfection and can only deduce it from our own conceptions, the most important of which is that of morality, and our explanation would thus be involved in a gross circle. And the next place, if we avoid this, the only notion of the divine will remaining to us is conception made up of the attributes of desire, of glory, and dominion, combined with the awful conceptions of might and vengeance, and any system of morals erected on this foundation would be directly opposed to morality. However, if I had to choose between the notion of the moral sense and that of perfection in general, two systems which at least do not weaken morality, although they are totally incapable of serving as its foundation, then I should decide for the latter because it is at least withdraws the decision of the question from the sensibility and brings it to the court of pure reason. And although even here it decides nothing, it at all events preserves the indefinite idea of a will good in itself, free from corruption until it shall be more precisely defined. For this reason, I think I may be excused here from a detailed refutation of all these doctrines. That would only be superfluous labor, since it is so easy and it is probably so well seen even by those whose office requires them to decide for one of these theories, because their hearers would not tolerate suspension of judgment. But what interests us more here is to know that the prime foundation of morality laid down by all these principles is nothing but heteronomy of the will, and for this reason they must necessarily miss their aim. In every case where an object of the will has to be supposed in order that the rule may be prescribed, which is to determine the will, where the rule is simply heteronomy, the imperative is conditional, namely, if or because one wishes for this object, one should act so and so henceforth. It can never command morally that it is categorically, whether the object determines the will by means of inclination, as in the principle of private happiness, or by means of reason directed to objects of our possible volition generally, as in the principle of perfection. In either case, the will never determines itself immediately by the conception of the action, but only by the influence which the foreseen effect of the action has on the will. I ought to do something on this account because I wish for something else. And here there must be yet another law assumed in me as its subject, by which I necessarily will this other thing. And this law again requires an imperative to restrict this maxim, for the influence which the conception of an object within reach of our faculties can exercise on the will of the subject, consequence of its natural properties, depends on nature of the subject, either the sensibility, inclination, and taste, or the understanding and reason, the employment of which is by the peculiar constitution of their nature attended with satisfaction. It follows that the law would be, properly speaking, given by nature, and as such, it must be known and proved by experience, and would consequently be contingent, and therefore incapable of being an apocalyptic practical rule, such as a moral rule must be. Not only so, but in inevitably only heteronomy, that will does not give itself the law, but it is given by a foreign impulse by means of particular nature, constitution of the as subject adapted to receive it. An absolute goodwill, then, the principle of which must be categorical imperative, will be indeterminate as regards all objects, and will contain merely the form of volition generally, and that as autonomy. That is to say, the capability of the maxim of every good will to make themselves a universal law is itself the only law which the will of every rational being imposes on itself without needing to assume any spring or interest as a foundation. How such a synthetical, practical, a priori proposition is possible and why it is necessary is a problem whose solution does not lie within the bounds of metaphysic of morals, and we have not here affirmed its truth, much less professed to have a proof of it in our power. We simply show by the development of the universality received notion of morality that an autonomy of the will is inevitably connected with it, or rather is its foundation. Whoever then holds morality to be anything real and not a chimerical idea without any truth must likewise admit that principle of it that here assigned. This, sorry guys, this section then, like the first, was merely analytical. Now to prove that morality is no creation of the brain, which it cannot be if the categorical imperative with it, the autonomy of the will, is true, and as a priori principle absolute necessary, thus supposes the possibility of a synthetic use of pure practical reason, which, however, we cannot venture on without first giving a critical examination of the faculty of reason. In the concluding section, we shall give the principal outlines of this critical examination as far as is sufficient to our purpose. And that, my friends, holy moly, is the finishing of section 2. Section 2, we finally did it. That was a lot of reading. A lot of reading. Transition from popular moral philosophy to metaphysics of morals. So I hope you enjoyed that long-winded but very necessary section. I hope with my situation that you were able to comprehend me. Sending each and every one of you love and light. Please don't forget to hit that like button, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Today is World Gothic Day. I celebrate me in all my forms, regardless of my chunky face. Sending each and every one of you love and light. I really hope everybody will have a really good rest of the week as we are starting on Monday very soon. I hope you all enjoy, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye, guys.